Shoney's is a classic chain of American restaurants, really one of the pioneers. With roots going back to the 1940s, it helped popularize the casual dining family restaurant. They were commonly found along highways, so they became associated with family road trips, and today there are many people who look back on Shoney's with fond family memories of eating Southern-style comfort foods or maybe their world-famous hot fudge cake. I mean, how could you not like that? By the middle of the 1990s, it was one of the largest restaurant chains in the country, rapidly approaching 1,000 locations before everything took a negative turn. I'm sure it wasn't a great sign when in 1998 they changed their famous tagline from classic American food to come back to what's good. I mean, it was bad. By the end of the decade, consistently declining comparable restaurant sales led to the closure of about half of their locations, and in the year 2000 they filed for bankruptcy. Throughout the following 2.5 decades, there have been numerous comeback efforts, including major menu changes, remodels, and most recently their rotating food bar. It feels like almost every year they have expressed plans to return to the glory days or something along those lines. Currently on their franchising website it says, "We're growing fast and expanding across the US and internationally." I don't know where all that comes from, because despite so much optimism, I think it is safe to say that these efforts have generally been failures. They have continued to close locations to a point where only something like 50 of them remain in operation. Yeah, not many people creating new memories at Shoney's anymore. So the obvious question here is, what happened? And that is what I intend to answer. For this video, I want to talk about the history of Shoney's while identifying 5 of the biggest reasons behind its decline. Starting things off with management chaos. I've never had this exact reason on a list before, but this is the best way I can put it. But backing up a minute to 1947, when Alex Schonbaum opened a small restaurant in Charleston, West Virginia called Parquet that soon became a franchise of the popular Big Boy chain, causing it to be renamed Parquet Big Boy. But in the 1950s, he wanted to change the Parquet part of the name, so he held a contest where the winning submission was Schonbaum's nickname, Shoney's. So that is where the name comes from. And in the early 1970s, after opening dozens of them throughout the Southeast, he combined his business with another Big Boy franchisor named Raymond Danner, and shortly after, they started phasing out that Big Boy branding. It was in favor of creating their own identity that included the Shoney bear mascot. In the following years, Raymond Danner served as the leader of the company, where he was generally considered one of the most respected CEOs in the industry. He was being praised for paying close attention to details, even personally visiting the restaurants to ensure that they were meeting his high standards as far as cleanliness and speed and hospitality and all the stuff you would hope to see in a family restaurant like this. Well, in 1987, he stepped down from the CEO position, and by 1993 left the board of directors, sold his stock, and became completely uninvolved, and that is when things became chaotic. Without getting too lost in the details here, which trust me is easy to do, the 1990s were filled with management changes, including 4 different CEOs, and fights for control, including a proxy fight where the founder's son and minority shareholder at the time, Raymond Schonbaum, tried to remove the management and board of directors from the company after the stock had declined about 70% over the past 3 years. He publicly criticized their decisions and even the food that they were serving at the restaurants, so it really seems like a lot of craziness and potentially panic behind the scenes at a time when they really needed to pull together and agree on a way to reverse the trends. My next reason is a discrimination lawsuit. In 1989, it was alleged that Shoney's was discriminating against African Americans when it came to hiring and promoting practices. It was a highly publicized lawsuit that at the very least gave people the perception that Shoney's did not want black people working in important or public-facing roles. The lawsuit continued on for a few years before ending in a settlement of over $100 million, which at the time was the largest ever in a case like this. That money was awarded to as many as 50,000 black employees who had worked for the company between 1985 and 1992. That year, the company reported what I believe to be their first ever official net loss. It was actually the reason former CEO Raymond Danner left the company, so it impacted them on multiple levels. A restaurant with such a positive reputation was now at the center of a big controversy, causing some longtime customers to see them in a different light or maybe even rethink eating there. Moving right along to the next reason on my list that is going to sound straightforward: high debts. I mean, of course, they would not be filing for bankruptcy unless they had a lot of debt, but a lot of it came from unexpected sources. Like, for example, in 1989, they paid a massive cash dividend of $16 per share, which translated to over $100 million for Raymond Danner, considering he owned 19% of the stock at the time. Also, in 1995, they acquired their biggest franchisee, TPI Enterprises they were named, for over $160 million, in a deal that was mostly funded through debt. Looking back, this one really seems like a bad deal because it included 176 Shoney's restaurants that were generally performing even worse than the ones that they already owned. That is not a good use of money, and the main issue with all of this debt is that it was constricting them. Restaurants were not being updated or remodeled, or any attempted turnaround efforts had trouble getting proper funding because a lot of their money throughout the decade went toward lowering that debt. To summarize here, an unprecedented legal settlement, an unusual dividend, and a questionable acquisition helped put them in a vulnerable position where falling sales and net losses were able to hurt them probably much more than they would have otherwise. Going back to the list, I will admit that my next reason has some speculation behind it, but I had to include it because I think it might be the most impactful: rapid expansion, and I have a lot to say about this. Throughout the 1980s, everything went pretty smooth for Shoney's as they grew at a manageable pace. In fact, early in the decade, Raymond Danner briefly stepped down as CEO, and the guy who replaced him bought a 225-location chicken restaurant called Famous Recipe, that they renamed Lee's Famous Recipe after the founder, and everyone felt that he was being too aggressive with the expansion plan, so Danner was placed back into the position. Well, the new leader in the early 1990s was arguably the most aggressive, expressing plans to dominate the family segment by adding 500 new franchises by the end of the decade. Now, here is where I speculate that too many of those new restaurants were opened outside of the Southeast. See, for many years, Shoney's was uniquely confined to that specific segment of the country. Remember, it originated as part of Big Boy. They had a franchising agreement that said they could only open restaurants throughout those 11 states. In fact, you might be surprised to learn that the D in Captain D's, the popular fast food restaurant that is a lot like Long John Silver's, comes from Raymond Danner. He is the one who started the concept, partially because he wanted to expand into other areas of the country, but was legally unable to do it with Shoney's at the time. In 1982, Shoney's paid the owner of Big Boy $13 million to end their franchise agreement and the area restrictions that came with it, finally giving them the freedom to expand outside of the Southeast. But anyone who has been to Shoney's can probably tell you that they already built such a strong Southern identity. In the 1990s, their spokesperson was Andy Griffith, and then in the 2000s, it was Jeff Foxworthy. What I'm saying here is that it is a concept that might not catch on as effectively in other markets, and certainly should not be rushed into them. At their peak in the mid-1990s, Shoney's restaurants could be found in 34 states, meaning they entered 23 new states in a little over a decade. When they started closing underperforming restaurants in a big way, not surprisingly, a lot of them were in those new states. Today, Shoney's has retreated back to the Southeast, so there's reason to believe that Shoney's has had trouble catching on throughout the rest of the country. I might even go so far as to say that it was a mistake in trying to do it so aggressively. My final reason on the list is going to be maybe the most predictable: competition, and there's a bunch of different ways to look at this. Most family restaurants have not quite been the same since the 1990s, as busy people started gravitating to more convenient alternatives. Really, at this point, it is hard to find any casual dining chain that is doing well, right? But I would like to take a minute to focus on buffet restaurants specifically. In 1981, following up on the success of their newly installed salad bars, Shoney's introduced their iconic breakfast buffet, and it was like a game changer. Their breakfast sales had been falling for a long time, and this almost instantly reversed that trend. They quickly expanded it to offer 40 items, which is more breakfast foods than I can possibly think of right now. It was in the early stages of what became a trend in the industry. Buffet restaurants started popping up all over the place. When things started taking a negative turn in the 1990s, I I think it is interesting that Ray Schoenbaum essentially said that they should return their focus back to the menu as opposed to their buffet because their buffet couldn't compare to competing options like Golden Corral. I highly recommend checking out my video about Golden Corral, or maybe one of my others about buffet restaurants if you want to learn more about what was happening around that time. Simply put, buffets were becoming more competitive and Shoney's did not have the money or the space to keep up with it. So then it was a big debate if they should try to reduce their reliance on buffets, but then that was a big part of why they grew to be so successful, so they were caught in the middle without any clear direction. Let me know in the comments, what are your thoughts about Shoney's? And maybe more importantly, what are your memories involving Shoney's? What specifically stands out about your experiences, and what do you think made them so special? It has turned into kind of a depressing subject at this point, so it might be good to think back at the better times. Looking back at the list, this is a lot of stuff to go wrong in such a short period of time. Mostly through their own decisions and actions, they were brought to a weakened position that made it very difficult for them to react when things started getting complicated. Tell me if you think something should be added or subtracted from it, and which factor do you think was the most impactful? Also, I just want to say, I think some of these other restaurants I mentioned, like Captain D's and Big Boy, have interesting stories, so let me know if you would like to see a video dedicated to either one of them, and any other thoughts you have about Shoney's, leave them in the comments. I'd like to hear what you have to say. Thank you for watching.